Hey, Tina. Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Welcome. Great to have you in the class. And I thought I'd send you a reply video here in week one. Um, I guess we started week two, but wanted to wait until you got your both your responses in before I sent anything to you. And this gives me a chance to say hello a little more personally and give you some initial reaction to what you've written in both response forums. In forum one, I think it's clear you spent a little time in Habakkuk, kind of trying to get a feel for what's going on in that book, how the development of that book, what's happening in that book might help us understand the line that Paul draws from it and then sort of uses in this really programmatic statement for the whole of Romans, that the just by faith will live. And as you say, Habakkuk is complaining to God about just outrageous circumstances. He is horrified that God has allowed such cruelty to befall his generation of the people of God at the hands of the Chaldeans, who are not worshipers of Israel's God. They're opposed to God, and yet somehow God has allowed them to just wreak destruction on Israel. And it's in response to that that we get this key line where, in contrast to these ways of the proud, ways of the arrogant, the calling of Israel is to live by faith, to refuse the temptation to give in to cynicism or to give up on God's law, on loving God and loving one another in the face of such overwhelming circumstances. So, in contrast to the ways of the arrogant, ways of the proud, the puffed up, the just will live by faith. So, this means trusting God enough to go on loving God and loving one another in the face of such impossible circumstances. And what's important for Romans, I think, is that this faith of the just depends on the faith of God. And you've brought that out in some of the secondary literature that you've engaged with. So it's not just about the human response of faith, it's about the, the faithfulness of God. The faith of God itself is what inspires, enables the faith of the human. And this is key for Paul, who says that the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, from the faith of God, the trustworthiness of God that inspires the faith of the human. But this again is in contrast to ways of arrogance, ways of boasting, ways of kind of oppressing others and taking advantage of the weak. I love how in this forum you've treated justice, the justice of God, as an action of God, an activity of God. You talk about it as overcoming evil. And I think that's the right sensibility. Justice isn't like a status that people have only. It's not just an attribute of God. It is the action of God disclosed in the history of the people of God and other peoples of the world. So that's going to be key for Romans as well, because the justice of God is about the dramatic action of God finally in the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one, which then spills out into the lives of people like these non-Jewish people that Paul is writing to, and gives them a share in the life of the Messiah, and thus the faith that enables them to be generous with others as God has been generous with them, to be hospitable around the table, as opposed to being judgmental or trying to rule over one another, being arrogant. Again, what faith is contrasted with in Habakkuk. So that's how that's going to play out, and that's very concrete. It's an action, it's a transformative way of living together that Paul is concerned to teach in Romans. So I think you've set yourself up to track with that pretty well. The second forum, I know you're looks like you're trying to just get it in before we move to week two. So it's a little short, but you've got some great highlights nevertheless here that I think are worth underscoring, and you've drawn, especially from the podcast here. But, often Romans is read as if it were about a contract, what we have to do to get what God wants to give us. But I think you can tell that that's not really the focus. The focus is on what God has done finally in the Messiah and the calling that this delivers to people, the power that it conveys to people. It's not about saying, here are the conditions you have to meet. And sometimes that's what faith is reduced to, is some condition we have to meet in order to be a part of God's people, enjoy God's blessings, salvation, this kind of thing. And that's really not what faith is in Romans. Faith is a gift of God, an expression of God's own faith that is shared with the human in the Messiah. And that hopefully will keep us from reducing the justice of God or what it's about to something that is a matter of conditions that human beings have to meet, because I don't think that's the focus or force of this letter at all. Obviously, this has political significance, which Elliot is bringing out. We'll talk more about that in the weeks to come, but hope this gets our conversation off to a good start. Thanks for the work you've done in week 1, and we'll look forward to more in week 2. Welcome again to the course. Oh, if you can, you don't have to reply to this video if you don't want, but at least maybe write received or something like that, so that I know that you were able to see it. Thanks again, Teena.